On today's Locked On Giants podcast, we're getting you ready for the NFL Combine, which starts on Tuesday. And what questions do the Giants need to come away with having answered from the Combine? We've got all that and more coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Train, a credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all our written work. And as always, welcome on into our Blue Crew community members, our newcomers, our everydayers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, it's Combine Week, folks. We made it. This is a big event on the NFL calendar. Everybody's en route to Indianapolis, which is one of my favorite cities, believe it or not. I really like, the compactness and how easy it is to get around Indianapolis, but it's also the site of the NFL Combine, where you start to pick up rumors and kind of get a feel for how things might turn out for your team that you're covering or team that you follow. So anyway, on today's show, we're going to take a look at some of the questions that the New York Giants absolutely positively have to answer from the Combine. And I'm going to give you also what I think is going to happen based on little tidbits I picked up here and there, and how I think things will play out. Now, just a disclaimer here, obviously things change. So, what might be true today as I record this might change depending on, different circumstances or unforeseen circumstances. But still, I'm going to try and give you the most recent information that I have, not just today, but also the rest of the week. And hope you'll keep tuning in for it. All right, let's start off with the questions. The biggest one, obviously, the quarterback situation. What are the Giants going to do there? Now, there have been reports that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward are not planning to throw at the Combine. Quite honestly, I don't think that's a big deal. They are both planning, from what I understand, to throw at their respective pro days. There are some people that are saying that it is a big deal that they're not throwing at the Combine. I don't think it's that big of a deal. The important thing for them is to impress during the interview process. That's where it's going to really come down to, and allow the Giants to kind of get inside their minds. What are they thinking on a specific play, calling back plays, and that sort of thing. So that being said, I got to be honest with you, folks. I know that there's a growing sentiment that the Giants will take one of those two guys. I'm not as convinced that that's going to be the case as of right now. I mean, and here's why I say that. If the Giants somehow work out a deal for Matthew Stafford, and there is a possibility that happens. It depends, of course, on whether Stafford and the Rams can come to an agreement on money. But if the Giants land Stafford, now the pressure comes off them to take a quarterback this year if they don't feel that there's one in the draft class that really, is worthy of that third overall pick. And quite frankly, folks, would I like to see them take a quarterback? If they weren't drafting third, I'd say yes. But to me, if Abdul Carter is sitting there, which I don't think he will be, if Travis Hunter is sitting there, which I think is a possibility, I think you got to go with those guys over the quarterbacks. I mean, the quarterbacks in this class, there's nobody in this class that, for me, really excites me. Now, that's not to say that the Giants aren't excited by them, but I do think a lot is going to boil down to what happens with their quest with Stafford. Now, if a potential deal, I should say, with Stafford doesn't come to fruition, and oh, by the way, I don't think the Giants will have to give up the first overall pick for Stafford. Will it be a second round pick? Possibly. But I think, once we know what the the compensatory picks are, which are going to be announced soon, then I'll be able to better, gauge what the compensation package would be to Stafford. And for those of you who are wondering, well, what about the money? There was a report by Peter Schrager of Good Morning Football that Stafford's looking for $50 million a year. Folks, that's the APY. That is not the actual real money. All right. You're going to have a base salary, which is going to be low. You're going to have the signing bonus because the Giants, if they acquire Stafford, they're going to rip that deal up that he has the last 2 years on his contract with the Rams. And they're going to give him a brand new deal. All right. Which will average out to APY, maybe around 50 million, which would make Stafford one of the top 10 highest paid quarterbacks. But the actual cap hit won't be too bad. And, coming up, I'm going to go into, depending on what happens with Stafford, I'm actually going to put together a proposal, a contract proposal, how I would attack this, because there's a factor that I don't think a lot of people are talking about when it comes to Stafford and the money, and not just Stafford, but also, any free agents. And that factor, quite honestly, comes in 2028. So if you sign Stafford, if you're the Giants, you acquire Stafford via trade and you sign him to a 3-year deal with 2 voidable years. All right. So that would mean he'd be under contract for 25, 26, 27. The voidable year, the first one would be 28. Well, folks, in 2028, if the NFL gets its way, they're going to have the 18th game added to the schedule, which means more money for the league, which means a bigger jump in the salary cap. So, folks, those of you who say that this is not doable with Stafford money-wise, it most certainly is doable. But, of course, the big thing is, what's the compensation to acquire him via trade, assuming, again, that he becomes available via trade. The Rams might say, nope, we're not having it. We want to keep him, or we've worked out a deal. We're going to retain him. That's also a possibility. But my feeling is, as of right now, that I think the Giants are going to make a big push for Stafford. If that falls through, then, maybe we revisit the quarterback situation at number 3. But, I think unless Cam Ward is sitting there, that it's really hard to maybe justify, spending a quarterback there. Because if it comes down to Cam Ward, or Hunter, I might roll the dice with Cam Ward. But I don't know that he'll be there. I really don't. Ideally, like I said, I'd like to see them take a defensive player because the defense was just as big of a problem, if not a bigger problem than the offense last year. But we'll see how Joe Schoen plays it. Whatever decision he does end up making, he can't get it wrong, because if they get this one wrong, Giants are going to be in deep, what. All right. And the chances of Shane and Dable returning after this year, just not going to happen if they get this wrong and they have another lousy season. All right. Now, coming up next, the next question, free agency. What's going to go down with free agency? We'll talk about that right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And coming up this week on Locked On Giants, I'm working on a couple of guests. I've got some fingers crossed. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I've got a couple of big names I'm hoping to have on the program. I won't tell you who they are until I have them booked, but these are people that I think you'll want to hear from. That's certainly something coming up. And of course, we will have wall-to-wall coverage of the combine. So if there's any breaking news, I'll do a video for those of you who watch on YouTube. If there's, obviously at the end of each day, we'll cover what happened, observations, what we learned from the combine. And oh, by the way, today, Tuesday, if you're watching this video on Tuesday, Joe Schoen is supposed to speak at 10 a.m. So as soon as he's done there, I will have a show for you on any relevant takeaways that he might have said. I'm not expecting him to really give any hints as to what the Giants are going to do. I don't think the Giants fully know what they're going to do, but there's always a little crumbs and little hints that if you really dig into, you will uncover. So that's what's coming up here on Locked On Giants. All right. Question number 2 for the Giants at the Combine, things that they have to get resolved. Free agency. Now, look, we know that the legal tampering period doesn't start until next month, but that doesn't stop teams and agents from getting together, whether it's over dinner, whether it's in the room, whether it's in the hallway. There's plenty of places at the Indianapolis Convention Center where if you want to sit down with somebody and have a conversation away from prying eyes, you can do so. All right. So this goes on all the time. All right. Teams will deny it, but who are they kidding? I mean, so agents, all the agents are going to be in town for the annual NFLPA agent meeting. There will be conversations. And oh, by the way, who's to say that Agent A, who represents one of your own free agents, doesn't represent also a free agent that you might be interested in? Now, I have said that if I'm the Giants, the free agents positions that I would approach, definitely, obviously, quarterback, if you don't land up with Stafford via trade. Cornerback is a big one. So is wide receiver, sneaky need there. All right. Now, some people say, oh, what about offensive line? Well, this year's offensive line class, I would double dip there. All right. I would go and see if I couldn't get a swing tackle for the offensive line, but I also would draft a tackle because you've got Jermaine Illuminor in the final year of his contract. He's projected to be the right tackle. You don't know what's going to happen with Evan Neal, if he's going to make the transition to guard, if that's really his best position. So that position is going to become a need before you realize it. So better to prepare now than to kick that can down the road to where now all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, we don't have any offensive line talent in the hopper. We've got to figure out what we're going to do. So I do think offensive line, they're going to double dip. They've got to get a veteran swing tackle who can play both the left side and the right side, considering how Andrew Thomas is now becoming a little bit of an injury-prone player. All right, I mentioned cornerback. All right, I don't think the Giants will re-sign Adoree Jackson unless, they have no other options, which is kind of the situation they were in last year. I would like to see the Giants get a young shutdown cornerback in free agency. Now, that's going to cost them, obviously, but they've got the money to do it. For those who missed the news, the salary cap is actually projected to be higher, around $275 million, maybe upwards to $282.7, I think it is. So Giants are going to have a lot of cap space, anywhere from, I think, up to $49 million in cap space. They can make it work, especially if you remember that the first year of all contracts is generally low because the base salary is going to be low, and the signing bonus is kind of what makes up the payment that a player is looking for. So the signing bonus, which can be prorated over the life of the contract up to 5 years, that's the chunk of the money. That's some of the guaranteed money that allows teams to make the first year of the contract very low. So, folks, it can happen. Don't sit there and say, oh, once they spend on, if they get Stafford, once they spend on him, that's it. No, not the case. With the money that the Giants have, they should be able to sign easily at least 3 veterans at, decent prices. All right. So that being said, cornerbacks, I would look at DJ Reed. That's the guy I've been pounding the table for, not just because of the connection with Marcan Manuel, the new defensive backs coach, but just a guy that, intrigues me. He's a pretty good shutdown cornerback, played with the Jets to start for the last few years. That's a guy I'd like to see the Giants really, see if they couldn't land. If not Reed, then there's Byron Murphy. There's Carlton Davis, who I think might be, the more logical target, might be a little bit more affordable than a DJ Reed or a Byron Murphy or even a Charvarius Ward. So, the Giants, they got to get a cornerback because the depth at that position is thin. The experience at that position is thin. All right. Get a guy in here who's a veteran, who's done well, who can play the game, and maybe help Deonte Banks, who regressed last year. Help him to develop into more of of the cornerback that they thought they or hoped they were getting when they traded up one spot a couple of years ago to get him. So that's, don't underestimate that, folks, especially with an older veteran, because that's so important to have an older veteran at every position group if you can, to kind of be the leader of that particular group, especially when they break into their position group meetings. So that's very important. And I do think the Giants are going to look to sign a veteran cornerback. I don't think they are going to go too crazy. I mean, I do think the Giants are going to sign a veteran cornerback, even if they take Travis Hunter, which, I would jump for joy if they took Travis Hunter. I think he would be a really good playmaker. Plus, he could potentially solve two problems for the Giants, two holes that they have. So get a veteran in here that can be a shutdown cornerback, even if you put him on a short-term contract. If you're going to get, Hunter in the draft, great. There's no such thing as too many cornerbacks. If you don't have Hunter available when you go on the clock at 3, and if by some stroke of luck, Abdul Carter is sitting there, take him and wait until day 2 to try and get your quarterback. But anyway, yeah, cornerback is definitely a position. Now, I've also mentioned wide receiver as a need. If Darius Slayton leaves, as I suspect he will, Giants are going to have a hole at our wide receiver too. All right. Jalen Hyatt, we still don't know what is going on here. All right. Can he be a wide receiver too? Last year he competed with Slayton, didn't win out. And actually, Hyatt saw his pass targets drop, which was kind of surprising. So you got to wonder what's going on there. Is he grasping the playbook? What exactly is going on with him? All right. Also at receiver, you've got Wan'Dale Robinson, who's basically your primary slot guy. I like Wan'Dale, but I don't want to see Wan'Dale getting 90 targets a year. I just don't. I mean, Wan'Dale's, I think he averaged 7.7 yards per reception. That was like ranked the last, ranked last amongst the Giants receivers. And as a slot receiver, I think he averaged 7.5 yards per reception, which based on a group of 15 receivers who had at least, I think it was at least 50 targets, Wan'Dale was us. So the bottom line is you want to get, if you're the Giants, you want to get a receiver in here who's a big body and who could stretch the field if you're going to lose Slayton, which I do believe is going to be the case. Now, do they go draft here? Do they go receiver? Do they go draft here? Do they go free agency? Well, free agency is going to cost them an arm and a leg. The receiver class, meanwhile, maybe not as deep as it was, the last few years. Still some talent there that maybe you can develop into a receiver too, but they need a complement for Malik Neighbors, especially if they do lose Darius Slayton in free agency, which again, I think will happen. All right. Another sneaky need, safety. All right. Now, this is a position where the draft class isn't really, deep. They're going to probably lose Jason Pinnock, I would think. I mean, if they do, I'm not so sure if Dane Belton is a guy that you want to see starting all the time. So the Giants are definitely going to need to address that position. And the question is, who can they get? There's some options out there, but, are they going to want to spend on that? All right. Which I kind of find ironic if you think about it, because, they didn't want to spend to retain Xavier McKinney a couple of years ago, or last year, I should say. And then, you've got a guy like Javon Holland from Miami, who looks like he's going to hit the market, and he's going to cost somebody, a lot of money. So it's kind of weird if the Giants end up, spending on a veteran safety after letting Xavier McKinney walk out the door as a homegrown talent. So we'll see if that plays out and what the Giants do there. All right. Now, coming up next, the next question is extensions for any of the existing players. We'll talk about that right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. We're getting you ready for the combine. It starts Tuesday. So if you're watching this video on Tuesday, that means it's time to get down and, try to figure out some of the clues and see what we can dig up at the combine. So right now we're looking at the biggest questions that the Giants will probably want to leave Indianapolis with some kind of idea as to how this might potentially be answered. So we've talked about the quarterback position, which is obviously priority number one, actually one, two, and three, if you want to go that far. We talked about the other free agent positions. Now let's talk about contract extensions for their own homegrown talent. Now the Giants obviously set themselves up to where they don't really have to do anybody's contract this year, but do they maybe want to get ahead of the curve, for example, and re-sign Micah McFadden? Do they want to re-sign Wan'Dale Robinson, two guys who are entering the final year of their rookie deal? So my take on those two guys, I don't think either will get an extension just yet. McFadden, they've got Darius Mawaso, who, played pretty well when pressed into action last year. So I'm not so sure that McFadden gets an extension. Wan'Dale, as I mentioned, good receiver, good slot guy, but I think you wait on him. I think you wait to see because, like I said, I have a feeling, if they get a wide receiver too, his targets are going to drop. So you kind of wait and see on him. Now, obviously, the danger is if you wait, they could have a big year and their value can go up. Quite frankly, I'm not too concerned with that. I think, if you're the Giants, you've got to fill some of these glaring holes. Quarterback, cornerback, like I mentioned, safety is going to be a glaring hole. And I haven't even talked about interior defensive line, which is a hole, but that's one I think the Giants are going to address via the draft. I mean, this draft class, interior defensive lineman is so ridiculously deep that, I think they could probably get a late day two pick that can walk in and start alongside of Dexter Lawrence. So, that's another position. Edge rushers, probably another position that's really deep where they can get in the draft. So there are options. Now, how the Giants are going to rebuild this roster, which stunningly underperformed last year. There's no other way to put it. They've got options. But as I've said before, they can't make mistakes. They make mistakes, and that's it for this regime, which I'm sure for some of you who weren't too happy that Shane and Dave were retained, you're probably like, go for it. Let's have another, bad year. Let's get in the top 5 next year for the draft and be able to take, one of the better quarterbacks that might be coming out next year. Folks, we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, it's going to be a very busy week in Indianapolis. And again, we will have all the coverage of what's going on. I'm going to try and keep up with all the rumors so that when I tape the show, I have the most recent information. But, stuff is going to be flying around fast and furious. So be sure you're checking not just the YouTube channel, but also check out New York Giants on SI. We're going to put a rumors page up there if you want to follow along there. And we'll just keep breaking everything down. So, folks, I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in, spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And Indy, tomorrow, see you on tomorrow's episode. Take care, everybody.